Right. Well, welcome to our brew system here at Blue Ghost Brewing Company. We have a 3-vessel, 2-barrel system, and the process of making the beer I'll go through briefly. But one of the coolest things I think about the beer making process is whether you're making 5 gallons at home, the way I started, or my first brewing job where I worked at Oscar Blues in Brevard, and we brewed 50 barrels at a time. To now, when starting Blue Ghost and we do 2 barrels at a time, the amount of time it takes to produce the beer that we make and the process is basically identical. The only thing that changes is the size of the equipment, which is, I think, pretty interesting. So with our 3-vessel system, our first one acts as a hot liquor tank, which is really just a hot water tank. We use the hot water to mix in the middle vessel the malt, which is mainly malted barley, but it can also be malted rye, it can be flaked oats, which is unmalted but just crushed, or corn or rice or any sort of grains. But with us being a craft brewery, the base of all of our beer is malted barley, and every beer that we make is well over 70% malted barley. As far as that goes. So in this process, we take the hot water, we mix it with the grain in this vessel, which is the mash tun, and also serves as the lauter tun for us. The mash tun is where we mix the grain with the hot water. The enzymes that are on the grain actually start breaking down starches and the sugars. And then the next step in that process is to separate the liquid from the solids and transfer them over to our 3rd vessel, which acts as our kettle and our whirlpool. The lautering process, we separate the grain from the liquid. We capture the liquid from that malted barley. Think of it like a barley sweet tea at this point. We call it wort. We transfer it over here. When this is full, we start the boiling process. The boiling process is when we add hops during the boil to either add bitterness or flavor or both, depending on the type of beer that we're brewing. And we get a lot of flavor from the hops at this stage in the game, and potentially later if we're dry hopping a beer like an IPA or something like that. When this has finished boiling, we'll actually whirlpool it. The whirlpooling allows the solids that have formed in the beer, whether it's protein or hot particles, kind of settle out, and it's the first step in clarification for the beer itself. From there, the wort that at this point, just after boiling, is about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. We cool it down through a heat exchanger. Think of it as a radiator, basically. We send cold water one way, the hot wort the other. We can cool 70 gallons of wort to about 60 degrees in about 25 minutes. At that point, we'll transfer the beer goes through the heat exchanger and into a fermenter. You see on my left here is an example of one of our fermenters. That fermenter is 79 gallons, so a barrel being 31 gallons, we can really fit about 2.5 barrels into it. And that's kind of where the yeast does all the hard work really in the beer making process. The yeast takes that sugar, sweet barley tea and transforms it into beer by breaking it down, releasing CO2 as I don't know if Katie, if you're able to zoom in on that one, you can see active fermentation happening with that saison that's fermenting right now. The yeast is producing the CO2, and that's why you see the bubbles coming up in that bucket. The other byproduct of that fermentation process is alcohol. It takes about 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on the beer. Most of ours are ales. Almost all of ours are ales. Occasionally we'll do a lager, but it's usually limited to the winter time because of our equipment limitation. But it takes about 2 weeks to have a beer go from the mash tun, lauter tun, and kettle to serving it on tap. And like I said earlier, you know, if you're at home, if we are at Oscar Blues, the timeline, the amount of time it takes is the same. It's just the size of the equipment that changes really, and how fancy your equipment is maybe too, depending on what you might be able to do. So that's a pretty big overview of the brewing process. Final steps in that is we'll take the fermenter after the beer is completely finished fermenting, and we test to make sure that no motor fermentation is taking place. We'll actually transport it to one of our back walk-in coolers, and from there we'll let the beer, it's called crash, and that just means we're cold crashing it. It allows the hops and yeast to settle to the bottom of the tank, at which point we'll take the fermenter and transfer the beer out of there into one of our bright tanks, which is right over here as well. I'm about to do that process here in a few minutes with our mango IPA. We'll transfer it into that tank, and that tank allows us to pressurize the beer and force carbonate it, at which point it's ready to serve, and the process is complete.